See that you're all joining in to the Zoom room. This is an exciting program that we have for you tonight, and there's been a lot of enthusiasm. If you have not tonight's presentation, that we very much appreciate. He's a former college philosophy professor and has a wonderful presentation for us tonight. So I'm going to turn the Zoom room microphone over to you, Chuck.
Well, welcome everybody, and glad to see so many have decided to join this experiment. And please be a little patient with us. Where these Zoom things are always a little bit technologically challenging, partially because of some of us are not used to it, and partially because the technology is not great. So we will get through it just fine. So let me start out with just a quick sketch of the whole introduction to Alsatian wines in terms of the program as a whole. Very, very quickly, the idea is that tonight what we're going to do is I'm going to give you kind of a basic introduction to Alsatian wines. And then the idea is for each of you to go out and find in your local wine markets, or however you want to procure the wines, to get 3 examples of Alsatian Rieslings, which between now and Monday the 23rd, which is our second gathering, you would try these wines with whatever food you decide to have them with. And also, it's really helpful. I think a big part of this process would be for you to share your experiences with tasting these wines, how you like them with the foods you tried, to share those on Slack. Everybody has access to Slack. And there's already a very nice collection of notes about finding wines and recipes. So that's a big part of this process. Just sharing with each other so you can read the notes that each one presents. And then on the 23rd, what we'll do is have a kind of more or less an open-ended discussion about what we learned and what we enjoyed, and maybe where to go from there. So we'll have tonight, then your homework is find the wine, drink it. I know it's tough, but you'll just have to try them and have them with food, and then we'll get back together and talk about them in a couple of weeks. So let's move right on to my sort of sketch about Alsatian wines. And Gani, can you put up the first slide for people? Okay. This map I find really helpful in just sort of getting us started in understanding Alsace and its wines. Alsace, and you can see it there, it's that little white section, of course. And it's a very old province. And, as I talk to people, okay, true confession, I've never been to Alsace. I was very close as an IES student on my way to Vienna from London. I was in Trier, but I've never actually been in Alsace. Although I have been loving their wines for many years. But friends from Alsace tell me that friends who have spent time there emphasize that it's really kind of a world unto itself. And I think this map sort of suggests that very thing. It's got some very interesting natural boundaries. The Rhine River it's essentially its eastern border, and then beyond, farther east, of course, is is Baden-Württemberg in Germany, and then to the south, of course, is Switzerland. To the east of it is a mountain range called the Vosges Mountains, and then, of course, I will say beyond that is France. And that phrase will become maybe a little clearer as we go. And then to the north is Saarland and the Rhineland-Pfalz. So friends, say that Alsatians think of Alsace as a world, is a little place unto itself. It's not really Germany. It never was really Germany. It never was really France. It's Alsace. And maybe one way to think about that, there is a river that runs through Alsace. It's called the Ile, and it starts in the Jura Mountains and sort of winds its way through Alsace and ends up it empties into the Rhine near Strasbourg. The Romans, who, a long time ago controlled much of this part of Europe, called this particular area the land of the Ile, and the Latin word that the Romans used to describe this place was Ilsus, which is where the name Alsace comes from. The Romans also called the land of the Rhine Rensis, which of course we know the word Rhineland today. So it's sort of this world unto itself, and I think has a lot to do with the wines from this region. Now it has, this province has historically been controlled by other countries over, and it's flipped back and forth many times. And again, friends tell me that Alsatians tend to say they think of France and Germany as protectorates of Alsace. And so it's been taken care of for many, many years, and even in recent history, it's flipped back and forth between German and French control several times in the last 150 years or so. And part of that cultural thing is, the Alsatians among themselves speak a German dialect, which is different enough from German that apparently if someone on a TV show is speaking the Alsatian dialect, they have to put subtitles on the screen so Germans can understand what's being said. And of course that language is a way of sort of preserving one's separate identity, as I think we all understand. So those are just some really basic kind of ideas about Alsace. Let me move on then to wine. And before I talk about wine and Alsace per se, I want to just very quickly talk about winemaking very generally. No one knows when wine was first discovered. I mean, a long time ago. And so they're basically myths about it. But the myths are kind of interesting. The myth essentially says, probably someplace in Egypt, somebody left a bunch of grapes in a pottery crock and forgot about them. And a couple of weeks later, suddenly remembered and went back to get those grapes and discovered those grapes were now a liquid in the bottom of this jar. And the liquid smelled a little strange. But being enterprising and curious, as study abroad students like us always are, somebody decided to take a sip of this liquid. Well, first sip seemed okay, and had another and another, and pretty soon that person had a very nice sleep that night. And the myth, of course, like all myths, has a certain kernel of truth. And the truth here is that grapes by themselves will turn themselves into wine. They don't need any human intervention. And the simple version is that the grapes get soft as they ripen. They eventually crush themselves, and therefore they end up in a grape juice. And naturally occurring on the skins of grapes is the yeast that is needed to convert the sugar in that grape juice into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So grapes will just take care of themselves in terms of making wine. And everything about winemaking is essentially humans sort of messing around the edges of that very natural kind of process. And now the ancients had no idea what was going on, how it happened, and they tended to think of it as a gift from the gods. In fact, there's, Jennifer mentioned I taught philosophy, and there's a line in Plato where he says that there's no greater gift from the gods to humans than wine. Some might argue the plow fits up in that same category of greatest gifts, but and we'll talk about the plow a little bit later too. So you have this sort of magical experience that the gods have, turned grapes into wine. Well, people were growing grapes before they figured out that they turned themselves into wine. So grapes spread wherever people went, and especially as people became more agricultural. So they liked having the fruit, and so we can, that sort of brings us to Alsace once again, that grapes were grown in that part of Europe a long time, even before the Romans got there and gave the area its name. It's generally thought that the Gauls, who were there much earlier, brought grape growing. There's no information whether they figured out that grapes turned themselves into wine, but they were certainly growing grapes. So wherever anybody could find that grapes would grow, they were inclined to do that. The Romans are given credit for improving the grape growing in this part of Europe when the Romans took over. But we have to be careful about that. No one understood the actual chemistry of wine. In fact, it was not until in the 1860s that Louis Pasteur finally figured out that what's going on in grapes or grape sugar becoming wine is the fact that yeast, I mentioned earlier, it naturally occurs on the grapes, but yeast is a catalyst in the chemical reaction, which brings it about that sugars turn themselves into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So up until 1860, no one knew, they knew it happened, they watched it, they tasted it, but no one really had any idea about the actual chemistry of what was going on. So, the Romans brought better grape growing than the Gauls had, but the Romans had some unusual, well, I shouldn't say unusual. I mentioned that somebody left grapes in a crock, and that crock was undoubtedly clay, because that's what the Mediterranean peoples tended to store grapes in. When they got up to Alsace in northern Europe, they found a whole bunch of trees. And so they started making barrels and started storing grapes in barrels. Here's another really fascinating thing about wine. From whenever it got started up until 1800, the youngest wine was always the best. It was the freshest. It was what people wanted to drink. And the same was true with beer. And one of the benefits to both wine and beer up until 1800 or so was, quite frankly, because no one understood such things, it was often safer to drink than water, because a lot of times water would kill you. What was in the water, which no one understood what precisely was in the water. So beer and wine were somewhat safe beverages. Can we have the second slide now, Gani? Thank you. Okay, so here we are. This is a picture of wine bottles from, I think it's 1708 in the upper left corner to 1812 in the bottom right corner. And what you see here is a curious change in the shape of these bottles. And I suspect all of you, as people interested in wine, will look at the top row and even half of the second row and say, well, those look like carafes. And that's exactly what they were. In 1708 and well into the 18th century, carafes were used essentially to carry wine from the barrel that it was stored in. Up until this time, wine was always stored in barrels. And the Gasthaus, or wherever you went to, the tavern or where you went to eat dinner, or even in your own home, you would have wine in a barrel. And then you'd have a flask like one of these to bring it to the table for dinner. And that was essentially what bottles were used for, in at least in terms of wine. Then another curious mistake happened. Somebody put some wine in one of these carafes, and they would put a cork or some kind of stopper in the opening of the bottle, the neck of the bottle. Mostly because a lot of times these places where people drank in taverns were in the basements or in the bottom floor of a barn. And oftentimes cattle were above where you would enjoy your dinner. And stuff would fall down from the floor above. So they put stoppers in the bottles just to protect them from getting whatever might fall through the cracks in the floor. Well, somebody left a bottle with some wine in it and a stopper in it, and again, forgot about it, and came back a while later, and it was very likely port. And the reason it was likely port is because they discovered, so the Europeans and the British, for example, they would go to Portugal, and they discovered that the best way to ship wine on a boat from Portugal to England was to dump brandy in it, because brandy made it more chemically stable. So somebody left some port in one of these bottles, stoppered up, and they discovered that it didn't fall apart and turn into vinegar like almost all wine did at that point, especially wine in a barrel eventually. Somebody discovered that it actually tasted better after it sat in the bottle for a while. And through this 100-year period, that bottle on the bottom right, if you look at it for a second, those straight sides and those long straight sides, that's a bottle that whatever was put in it was meant to be stacked on it, their sides, and the bottles would stack and not fall over in a stack. And that was a stack meant to age wine. So you go from Carras carrying it to the table to wines to be aged. Okay, Gani, we can stop the, yeah. Okay, so, all right, so we're up to about 1800 now. And, you know, winemaking pretty much went straight forward for quite a while. And not much really, I mean, other than people started making wines to age in a bottle over a very small number. Most wines were still drunk very, very soon, as quickly as they possibly could. But I want to switch now to start talking about wines of Alsace today. And what I'm really referring to is wines of Alsace since World War II, because the 19th century, you know, wine making improved, the chemistry was understood, transportation got better, so wines could be moved around a lot more easily. But not, you know, the way the world of wine is today really comes out of the end of World War II, where vineyards were essentially decimated because of all the damage that was done because of World War II. Okay, so you remember that picture of Alsace, that tiny little strip of land. The part of Alsace that where the grapes are grown is even tinier. In fact, it's incredibly tiny. It's an area that's maybe 60 miles long, north to south, and maybe 3 miles wide. So it's just this strip, and it's essentially a strip sort of right down the center, a little bit closer to the Rhine, to the east side, to the Rhine River, and maybe 60 miles north to south, and 3 miles wide. So it's a very, very tiny area. And I want to quickly go through the major grapes that are grown there today. These, by the way, are grapes that were native to this area dating back for as long as anyone knows. I said earlier, the Romans brought better viticulture, but the grapes that were grown were essentially native to this area. So one of the grapes that is made in Alsace today is called Gewürztraminer, and some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that grape. And it's about 20% of all the grapes grown in Alsace. It tastes a little bit sweet. Almost any version of Gewürztraminer is sweet. It's more because it's low. The wines are low in acid. If you think about, lots of people describe a yellow tomato as tasting sweet. It's generally not because they're actually sweet, but because their acid is lower than red tomatoes, and the absence of acid makes them taste sweet. So Gewürztraminer is one of the Alsatians talk about 4 noble grapes. One of them is Gewürztraminer. The second one is Muscat. And I mention it only because it's grown there, but you almost have to go there to get one. I doubt if anybody has we don't have a way to answer, but I suspect very few of you have ever had an Alsatian Muscat. You almost never see them in this country. You certainly see Gewürztraminer. The third noble grape of Alsace is called Pinot Gris, Gris. And it's a very interesting grape to try. Probably most of you have seen in a wine store or in a grocery store in a wine section, you have seen an Italian wine called Pinot Grigio. That's because that's about the only white wine from Italy you see anymore. It's the same grape as the Alsatian Pinot Gris, but I strongly recommend if you have tried Pinot Grigio, and if you like it, I suggest you try Pinot Gris from Alsace. If you don't like Pinot Grigio, I still suggest you try Pinot Gris because you'll be shocked at how different they are. It's fascinating the different ways that winemaking produces those 2 grapes. And there's a lot of Pinot Gris, about 16% of the Alsatian wines are Pinot Gris. And then of course there's Riesling, which we'll get to, and it's about 21%. Another grape in Alsace that's not considered a noble, one of their top grapes is Pinot Blanc, and you'll see quite a bit of that. And actually there's one red grape grown in Alsace, Pinot Noir, the same as in Burgundy in France, but it's very, very light bodied. And then there's a grape, pretty rare, but if you ever see one, I suggest you get it. It's called Auxerrois. It's Auxerois. It's essentially, it's the reference is to the city in France, Auxerre, Auxerre. And it's a fascinating grape. There's not much of it. So just, if you see it, get it. Okay, so now let's turn to our real focus, which is Riesling itself. And I'll just sort of unapologetically say it's one of the reasons that we're doing this introduction to Alsatian Rieslings is because I don't think I'm alone in thinking it is clearly the premier quality grape in Alsace, the premier wine grape. And there's a lot of support for that. So, you know, on the Trimbach winery webpage, they describe it as it's emblematic of Alsatian wines. And I'll say more about Trimbach in a little bit. Now, the Alsatian fascination with Riesling comes very clearly from their German protectors from the past. Riesling is a dominant grape in Germany, and it's one of the, you know, if you look at the history, sort of, okay, after wine started being aged in bottles around 1800, if you look at the history of wine for the 19th century and into the 20th century, there are essentially 5 different wines that are very highly regarded worldwide, or at least Western Europe and the United States. I'm not really talking about Asia or, but and those 5 grapes are Burgundy and Bordeaux and Champagne in France, port from, of course, Portugal. And the 5th really extraordinary wine is Rieslings from Germany, and in particular Rieslings from the Rheingau region and the Mosel region, both of which are just north of Alsace. And the reason those wines were so widely distributed and regarded, it had a huge amount to do with the fact that wealthy British people got very excited about those 5 wines, and they were willing to pay large amounts of money to get the best examples of those wines that they could possibly get. And that marketing and that sales in Great Britain really pushed Burgundy, Bordeaux, Champagne, port, and that I think I forgot to mention the British tend to call German wine Hock, H-O-C-K, which is an abbreviation of the town Hochheim in the Rheingau. So the German Hock wines of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and after World War II, up until the 1990s, German wines, the really extraordinary German wines, were essentially sipping wines. That they were wines that people drank. You go to somebody's house in Germany on Sunday afternoon, and they'd serve little cookies or little cakes, and their Rieslings just to sip. They are actually quite low in alcohol, 8% maybe, 9%, 10's almost high for some of these wines. Those of us who were old enough to be drinking wine in the 70s or 80s will probably remember a wine called Blue Nun. That is not a noble German wine, but it's very much an example of what these wines are like. That was a very inexpensive, easy drinking things for college age kids at that time. But there were extraordinary examples of that same kind of wine with just amazing delicacy and complexity. And so the Alsatians, when, after World War II, when they just were thinking about rebuilding their own wine industry, they really looked to the Germans in these wines from the Rheingau and Mosel as a model. One other piece of this story that is fascinating, I think. Riesling, one of the reasons Riesling can make an extraordinary wine in the Rheingau and in Mosel is because, I mentioned earlier, grapes turn themselves into wine, and we don't have to do anything to make that happen. We just sort of nudge it along. There's another very fascinating mystery about wine grapes, and that is the very, very best wines tend to grow in those places that are totally on the margin of where that grape will ripen. And so for Riesling, the absolute margin, the northern limit, they call it, where Riesling will ripen, is right there in the Mosel and the Rheingau. You go any farther north and it will never produce enough, it'll never ripen enough to make a decent wine. You go any farther south where it's warmer and you get blue nun. You get a perfectly okay, simple wine, but all the complexity is gone. And a big part of the reason is the vines have to struggle, and they have to struggle just to survive. And to survive, what they do is they push roots deeper and deeper into the soil. And in putting roots deep into the soil, they then bring nutrients back up into the fruit that they produce. And that gives the fruit a complexity that when they don't have to struggle, they just don't have all this flavor constituents. And in the Mosel and the Rheingau, those grapes are grown on these astonishing hillsides. They're so steep that you can barely, walk on them. They have to build these terraces, and they're on hillsides facing the river. And so what happens is the sun in these marginal areas hits the river, bounces off the water when the sun shines. The light goes up into the vineyard, and the vineyards, these terrace vineyards, are filled with rocks. And the rocks warm up and they keep the grapes warm through the night and enable them to prosper. The Germans have a saying that sort of expresses this, and in German it is "Wo ein Flug gehen kann, so kein Rebstock stehen," which means where a plow can go, you should not plant a vine to make grapes. In other words, it has to be so steep that they actually have to cultivate these vineyards by hand with a hoe or some kind of hand tool. You can't even take a plow up into these vineyards. Okay, there are other Rieslings other than Germany. They're in California, they're in Washington, there are lots of different places. They're all very nice wines, but I'll just say none of them have the incredible complexity that the German Rieslings have. Okay, so what did the Alsatians make of all of this? And that's where I think our story really kind of begins. And the fundamental thing that the Alsatians did, I think, is they took this, they saw what Riesling could do, but they made some really important radical decisions. And the fundamental one was they decided to make a wine to go with food, to go with a meal. And so Alsatian Rieslings are emphatically food wines. Germans, for most of their history, up until pretty recently, and still, by and large, drink beer with their food. And their food goes very nicely with beer. The Alsatians probably clearly influenced by their French protectorates and friends. French wines are almost all meant to go with food, and so the Alsatians said, well, let's see what we can do with Riesling to make it make a wine that will go with food. And so what they did was, instead of producing the wine the way the Germans did to make these low alcohol, slightly sweet sipping wines, the Alsatians decided to convert. I mentioned, way back at the beginning, grapes, the sugar in grapes will turn itself into alcohol. And if you let that go, and essentially all the sugar is converted to alcohol, you get a wine. The resulting wine has essentially no sugar left over, no residual sugar. And the wine tastes what we today, of course, I'm sure most of you know, we call them a dry wine. And so the Alsatians said, well, we're going to make a Riesling to go with food. So they ferment all the sugar into alcohol, which means an Alsatian Riesling is going to have, instead of 8% alcohol, it's going to have 12 or 13%. So and they're also, because of the no longer any presence of sugar, you're going to taste the acid in that clear acidic taste is perfect to match all kinds of foods. Okay. Gani, maybe we should have the next slide if we may. Thank you. Okay, so here we have one of the wines that I recommended getting from a winery named, obviously, Trimbach. And you'll notice on this label that it says Appellation Alsace Contrôlée. That's in France, there's this wines are labeled according to their origin, where they come from. And so this AOC, Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, is one of the classifications of Alsatian wines. And what's interesting about it, again, the Alsatians sort of follow the French, but they don't. Alsace is the only wine producing region in what is now, France, where they are now politically, that is identified by the name of the grape which is on the label. So you see the word Riesling here. Every other French wine outside of Alsace, their classification is defined by a geographical place. It's a town in Burgundy or a village in Bordeaux or the Rhone. All other French wines identify themselves by geographical place, and none of them name the grape that goes into that wine on the label. So that's one of the major differences. And when this wine says Riesling, that means 100% of the grapes in this wine are Riesling. Every other country has, if you put a grape name, I mean, we're all familiar with grape names on wines. I mean, almost every American wine has Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or Riesling on the label. But in our country, I think it's now 75% of the grapes have to be Riesling for them to call it a Riesling. But in Alsace, it has to be 100%. Now, you may also see on a label like this, in addition to the word, actually it would be right underneath the word Riesling. There's some other words that you might see. One would be reserve, which identifies, this is what you're looking at, this Trimbach Riesling. This is their entry level Riesling. And then if you see reserve on it, you'll notice two things. First of all, you see the word reserve, and you'll notice that it costs more money than the regular, because it's a step up in quality. You may also see reserve personnel, which is a step higher still. And then you can see other things, but what's essential here is, first of all, of course, Trimbach, the producer's name, Appellation Alsace Contrôlée, and Riesling. Those are the really defining things for this label. Now you might also see other words like a vineyard name underneath Riesling. You might see the name of a person like Cuvée Théo or Cuvée Albert or and those, if there's other words other than Riesling, other than the producer's name and Riesling, if there are extra words on the label, that almost always means it's a higher classification. And it should be a better wine, and it will cost more money. Okay, so, and all right, so this is an entry-level label, and this is what we are focusing on. That when I said earlier, I want you to go out and find 3 Alsatian Rieslings, this is the class of wine I think we should try. There are higher levels, and I'm going to talk about them briefly, but for our purposes, these wines are absolutely what you want to pay attention to. It's the right place to start. Find out what the baseline is, and then if you get excited and you want to spend more money, you're certainly welcome to do that, and you probably enjoy it. An entry-level Alsatian Riesling is, I would say, the price range, you're talking $20 to $50 a bottle. You might find some in the teens, upper teens, but 20 is kind of a beginning point. Now, there is a second classification of Alsatian wines called Alsace Grand Cru. Grand Cru should sound expensive. It is. These are single vineyard wines. You'll see the words Grand Cru on the label. You'll see the name of the vineyard on the label. And now we're talking price range, $50 to $100 is almost guaranteed. And you can go up to 400 if you really want to. Actually, Trimbach makes the most expensive Grand Cru Riesling, and it's $300, $400 a bottle. Then there are late harvest wines, and again, these are not things I'm asking you to try, but you'll see the Alsatians on their late harvest wines, they use the French word vendage tardive, late harvest. And then there's an even higher classification called Sélection de Grand Noble. And if you see that on the label, you're going to spend a whole lot of money. These are super sweet wines, very special occasion kinds of things. Okay. So the handout that Jennifer sent everybody who signed up for this introduction. I recommended 3 wines, and the label you're looking at now, this Trimbach is the first recommendation. And I want to emphasize the word recommendation. Any 3 Alsatian Rieslings in this $20, $30 price range would be just fine. The reason I picked Trimbach is there are several reasons. One of them is they really are kind of a Riesling specialist, and they make a lot of wine. They make about over 1 million bottles a year, make over 500,000 bottles of Riesling, not all at the entry, most of them at the entry level, and some of them at the $400 level. So you're very likely to see, no matter where you are in the United States, you're very likely to see a Trimbach Riesling available. The other very large producer that you're almost guaranteed to see is called Hugel, Hugel. And they're similar to I mean, and if you see Hugel, don't have any hesitation to get it. There's also another large producer named Leon Beyer, Beyer. You don't have to write these down, but I'm just sort of giving you some of the names. Okay, so Trimbach is one good example, and I guess the other reason I think if you get something like a Trimbach or a Hugel, it's a very good benchmark. And then when you try any of the others, you sort of say, okay, well, you can have something to compare it to. Okay, can we go to the next slide, Donnie? All right, the second wine that I recommended is this Maison Willem. And actually, I chose this for a couple reasons. It's probably going to be less expensive than the Trimbach, depending on what level you get. This happens to be, yeah, you notice at the bottom of the bottle, that's what I was talking about earlier. This is a reserve. So this is one step up. You can find a plain Willem Riesling. This is one class up, and it should cost a little more, but it may still be less expensive than the Trimbach. And it's a perfectly good Riesling. I've been drinking these for years and very much enjoy them. They were actually the first company to export Rieslings to the United States after the repeal of Prohibition in the 30s, before Trimbach, before Hugel, before the big ones. And according to their according to their website, it was Al Capone's favorite after he got out of Alcatraz anyway. And they were actually certified as organic in 2012. And again, there are many alternatives to this and another very basic kind of Riesling. You might see Kunzbach, you might see Ostertag, Lucien Albrecht, I think I mentioned on the handout, Pierre Spar. Again, don't worry about finding those particular ones. If you find any Riesling from Alsace in the $20 to $30 range, perfectly good to get. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about the kinds of wines made in Alsace, I talked about just AOC like this or the Trimbach, and then we talked about Grand Cru. There's a third group of wines made in Alsace called Cremant d'Alsace. And it's actually a sparkling wine. And my advice is, if you see a Cremant d'Alsace, try it. They are much less expensive than champagne. Typically $20 a bottle instead of 50. And they're very, very interesting wines. They're, yeah, maybe not quite as complex as a French champagne, but they're really amazingly pleasant. And Villa makes some very nice Cremant d'Alsace. Okay. Can we have the next slide, please?
And Chuck, I want to be able to tell you too, we're at an hour and I don't want to lose anyone. So I want you to be able to get through your review so that we'll be all prepared.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you for, I was just looking at my time, and I obviously can keep babbling on forever.
No, you have great information. This is super.
Okay, I will speed up. Okay, this is the third recommendation. Domaine Weinbach is one of the premier producers of Rieslings in Alsace. You will spend a little more money on one of these than on a Trimbach or a Willem for sure, but the quality is there. I mean, tasting this next to the Trimbach, you'll see, you know, you'll see a very, very clear difference. You may like the Trimbach more. I'm not saying they're better, but you'll see a difference, and it's worth, you know, exploring the difference. Okay, so I think that we can end with the slides at that point. Okay, so the only last thing right, so find 3 entry-level Rieslings, 20, 30, 50, up to, don't spend more than $50. Seriously. If you want to, go right ahead. But you know, I think for our purposes, and then, okay, so as I said earlier, the real issue here is these are food wines. So I really, in fact, they're not really good sipping wines. They go great with food, and they're a little strong by themselves. But try them with, and there's some notes in the handout about, you know, there's classic Alsatian food that these go great with. And do share in Slack the things that you try these foods with. So there are classic Alsatian dishes that you can have, but be experimental. If you want to try them, you know, anything you drink white wine with, try them with. Last night I had a Trimbach Riesling with grilled tuna, and it was an interesting experiment. I'll say something in Slack about that. But Chinese food, Indian food, I mean, these will stand up to spicy, you know, fish. The classic Alsatian stuff is white meats, either fowl or pork, sausages, but it's all got a French flair to it. It's not quite heavy like a lot of times German food can be. As somebody who spent a year in Vienna eating Wiener Schnitzel mit pommes frites on a regular basis, and there are a couple of my classmates in this group that can vouch for the heaviness of
Yes.
of German wines, German food. Okay, and in the spirit of wanting to encourage you to share, I'd like to call on, is Bob Shannon in the group?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to introduce Bob Shannon, who was a student in Freiburg in what, 80, 81, I think?
Correct.
And Bob actually he's been to Alsace. Of course, he went to school 50 miles away or something like that. But he's also taken groups to Alsace on wine tasting. So I'm going to let Bob say a little bit about his experiences. Bob?
Sure. No, and very quickly, Chuck, thank you for doing a really incredible introduction to Alsatian wine. And when I heard that you were talking about Alsatian wine, I was actually a student in 1980. And then I went back to Germany. It was, I was smitten with Germany. I went back and ended up working as a student counselor through the 1980s. I left in the end of 1989. And in that process, I took hundreds of students to Alsace as well as many other places, but to Alsace to visit Colmar. There's great museums there, up into the Vosges Mountains, but then also to do wine tasting. And it was always just a real pleasure to just see people light up when you do, well, you always light up when you do wine tasting, I think. Yeah. But I think they really never expected that region would really have as wonderful wine as it does. And, I think it's important to say, anybody who's spent time in Freiburg, or if you know Freiburgers, they might even take some exception to saying, well, let's talk about Alsatian wine because the Freiburg wine is the best, right? And if you spent time in Freiburg, you know that everything was about wine festivals and the like. So there's a common appreciation of wine across the Rhine right there, and slightly different versions of wine, but pretty similar in the big picture. So it was always really fun to take people to Alsace. And when I was there, we went to Egesheim a lot of the time because they really did fantastic tours. We went to Trimbach a couple of times, but all in all, it was really, really fun to really go out, take a quick trip to Alsace, and then to finish with the wine tasting. So I know that continued probably after I was there. I don't know exactly what happened it's been several decades since then. I'm sure that all of you have been on wine tastings, and I hope that some of that has stuck. But I just wanted to at least say, welcome and thank you very, very much, Chuck, for doing a really, really wonderful introduction to Alsatian wine.
So. Thanks, Bob. And by the way, that Egesheim co-op that Bob was referring to, I believe it's now called Wolfberger.
They were Wolfberger way back when. I mean, they've been branded as such forever. Okay. But they've really pushed forward, and they were a relatively large cooperative, but they also had very high quality wines, and you're probably never going to find them in this country, which is very, very sad.
Yeah, so. That's the sad part. Yeah, because I've heard of them, but I've never seen a bottle. So I know we're running over, and I don't want to tax our hosts. So you want to?
So Chuck, I can. Do you have any the homework for everyone is that they're going to find a selection of Rieslings and then find some pairings. They'll refer to your worksheet that you gave us, right?
Yep.
And then to discuss the hits and misses in this Slack channel. And hopefully everyone has information from the Slack channel. If not, please email Jennifer or me at IES Abroad. That would be great. And this is great fun for me personally that Chuck chose, I have to tell you, chose the Alsatian wines because I studied abroad in Strasbourg, France, in college. And this is Petite Alsace behind me, a picture of Petite Alsace in Strasbourg. But anyway, and it's just wonderful to see you all and see your smiling faces. And I recognize so many of you now, and that's great fun too. And I hope that you all join us again on November 23rd. And then we'll be more interactive and we'll talk more about what our experiences were and what we thought of the wines. And we'll learn more about the Freiburg wines. I have to learn more because I became very siloed in Strasbourg, Bob, and I thought, oh no, the Strasbourg. And I discovered the Cremants, that too much to my my chagrin. So I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Chuck, again, for a wonderful event today. Thank you.
Sure.